Good afternoon, and thank you for joining our AWS Online Exec Connect. We're excited to be meeting with you today, as we have seen an outpouring of interest from the finance community across EMEA around the topic of digital transformation. My name's Phil Le-Brun. I'm an AWS Enterprise Strategist and former technology executive at McDonalds Corporation, and I'm pleased to be hosting you today. The Enterprise Strategy team consists of former CXOs from large organizations who have led large-scale transformations and have also been customers of AWS. We work with enterprise executives around the globe to share experiences and strategies for how the cloud can help them increase speed and agility while devoting more of their resources to their customers. We recently shared an ebook written by one of our colleagues, Mark Schwartz, entitled How to Think Like a Digital CFO. It had over 800 downloads from finance leaders across EMEA. In the ebook, Mark covers a number of topics that we all find come up in discussions with chief financial officers. The underlying question in most of these discussions is, how can I be more agile and more competitive without sacrificing the control I believe I have over investments today? We also recently wrapped up an extensive research project with 10,000 senior business decision makers in enterprises across France, Germany, Israel, Spain, and the UK. Our goal was to understand how they managed to keep reinventing their businesses during the COVID-19 pandemic without a roadmap around what was going to happen next, and to get insights into how they expect their organizations to build on that experience and keep growing in the post-pandemic world. We found that 65% of business decision makers are confident that their organization is now agile and can easily change or adapt to suit market or societal shifts over the next 12 months. Many have a positive outlook for the year ahead. 89% expect their business to grow in the next year, on average predicting a rise in revenue of 21%. Nearly 2/3 of decision makers said they deployed new cloud services and tools during the pandemic, while 40% used cloud for the first time. Remarkably, digital transformation initiatives were brought forward by an average of 2 years and 5 months. In today's session, we'll discuss some real-world learnings and advice. I hope that you will reach the same conclusion as my guest and I did previously. Adopting more agile ways of working and cloud computing gives you more control, more flexibility, and more certainty. I'm joined today by my colleague from our Enterprise Strategy team, Chris Hennesey, a former CFO at Capital One Financial Corporation. Capital One recently announced they were going all in with AWS. In today's agenda, we'll cover Chris's perspective on the Capital One digital transformation as a former CFO, along with insights on critical success factors to a successful CIO-CFO partnership while transforming. And now I'll hand the discussion over to my colleague, Chris Hennesey.
Thanks so much, Phil. As Phil said, my name is Chris Hennesey, and I am an Enterprise Finance Strategist at AWS. I've just joined in the last 3 months, and I'm so excited to be here with you today to listen, learn, and actively engage with other finance professionals. I was with Capital One for over 20 years in the finance organization and led their digital transformation from a technology standpoint. I'm very excited today to share information with you around Capital One's digital transformation, their transition to the cloud, but also from a CFO's perspective of things to look out for as you go through this transformation. As you can see, Capital One is a very large-scale company. It's in the Global 2000 in the top 150 companies. It's a founder-led organization, which at its roots makes it a builder organization. It's got over 70 million customers and over 10,000 software engineers. Capital One has a very large presence in the US, but it does have operations and is a top 10 lender within the UK as well. So there are 4 key tenets that I thought would be valuable for you all to hear as we think about digital transformation of Capital One. All of these occurred within the last 10 years of the organization, but it's really accelerated the pace through time. So the first one was the talent transformation. One of the initial building blocks for Capital One, they believed they needed to flip the labor mix of their software and data engineers. In the beginning of the journey, there was a really heavy reliance on third-party staffing companies to both run and enhance their applications. And they believed that in order to not just keep up with competition, but to accelerate and outpace them, they needed to bring some of that talent in-house. It needed more mobile development and other software engineering and technical talent on the data side. And they believed they needed to write their own software in order to succeed. So it shifted from 75% outsourced to 75% in-house over that last 10-year period. It needed IT teams to work hand in hand with the business units to develop new capabilities. So that was their point of view, and one of the big changes they made was building a talent pipeline that would enable them to help shape and develop that talent inside the organization. The second area of focus in their digital transformation was open source. Capital One began to think beyond its own walls in terms of application development in this journey. It leveraged the power of the open source community to innovate quickly and build software that had high quality and was highly secure. It not only leveraged open source software, but it also contributed to projects and also invested in the community. It was really a focused effort to strike a balance between managing risk and minimizing development bottlenecks that existed inside of the organization. The third factor that really drove the digital transformation for Capital One was the shift to agile and DevOps specifically. At the same time as the talent revolution, Capital One began testing out agile development, doing more iterative and collaborative development. It learned through the ceremonies of agile that it could just really accelerate the pace of innovation. It took the rip the Band-Aid off approach and trained thousands of engineers on agile practices in a very short time frame. It created all the critical roles. I know many of you and our customers struggled between product and business alignment with IT. So there was a product owner for every agile team, the developers, designers, and scrum masters in small autonomous teams to enable to deliver capabilities for its customers. It matured its DevOps practices and really focused on continuous integration as a way to real-time test and deliver capabilities. It went from quarterly to monthly to now multiple daily releases into production through this transformation. And then lastly was the cloud transformation, last but not least. That was a key element in terms of delivering infrastructure and ensuring it provided on-demand resources to the engineers. Capital One, through this migration to the cloud, rebuilt 80% of its applications to be cloud native. And I'm going to spend the next couple of slides talking through what was the cloud migration journey like, what were some of the best practices, and specifically from a CFO vantage point, what are some lessons learned through that? This is a depiction of what the last 6 years or so looked like and the approach that we took. One of Capital One's outcomes it was striving for was to get out of the data center management business. So you'll see at the bottom swim lane the number of data centers, owned data centers that Capital One leveraged and ultimately deprecated through this time. But just like many of you, it started small, experimenting with a mobile application, a key customer application that would really benefit from the cloud native skills. It tested that in a small fashion just to learn how the cloud would work for a large enterprise and began to roll that out. In 2016, it began to develop a lot of the mobile banking and web development in production. And did a lot of work in inventorying and doing the asset management critical work to understanding what was the full inventory that had to be modernized and or lifted and shifted as we went through the migration. One of the big keys for Capital One you'll see in 2018 was a declaration of no new on old. That was really a forcing mechanism to ensure that we would not continue to maintain old applications that were not aligned to the strategy of exiting data centers. And that really was a springboard that enabled Capital One to fully get high velocity going to the cloud. And then lastly, as you mature and through this, there was a large focus on kind of the networking and the infrastructure of pulling all that out at the end and optimizing and maturing our practices. As a finance professional, my team and I kind of evolved our skills and knowledge and awareness of the technical dynamics through this time, really partnering closely in a FinOps dynamic with the development teams to instill transparency and accountability and to drive efficiency in using the cloud, one of the big benefits of the cloud. In terms of the benefits for Capital One specifically and things that all of our customers tend to see, the first and foremost is around the pace of innovation. The really enabling and empowering engineers to not have infrastructure be the long pole in the tent and enable them to test and rapidly develop was a key element to ensuring that we got the benefits of the agile practices that we instilled. The second was around security and resiliency. A large area of focus as Capital One being a highly regulated institution was around ensuring that we were improving the security and resiliency as we went to the cloud. A lot of this ties into architectural practices and how you shift into the cloud and really fully leverage the capabilities that exist. And that was something Capital One did and did very well. And then lastly is around driving efficiency and simplicity. Obviously, a core competence for Capital One was not being in the data center management business. It didn't have the scale as much as AWS, and ultimately enabled it to exit that business. It also eliminated the need for large cash outlays and capital investments that I know that are near and dear to CFOs' hearts. And then lastly are the developer productivity gains. This was probably the biggest benefit that Capital One, and I know many of our customers see, which is really enabling and driving efficiency for developers and driving simplicity in the way in which they operate. I next want to just share some vantage point from my point of view as a CFO going through this and some encouragement for you all as finance professionals of things to consider. The first is for you and your finance team to be open to learning and adapting. There's a lot of processes that we have in finance, anywhere from procurement to accounting practices, as well as allocations and forecasting. All of these were challenged and changed as we went to through our cloud transformation. So my encouragement to all of you is just be open and lean into the new opportunity because change is inevitable. And as long as you go into this transformation knowing that, I think that is a key element from an expectation standpoint. The second is around asking why and how a lot as you go through this. Just changing your infrastructure in its own is not going to drive the transformation you need. You really need to challenge the ways in which you operate, the processes you have, as well as the infrastructure you have to drive this. So really encourage experimentation, encourage asking why, and really reward people in your organization who are taking advantage of the capabilities that are opened up as you move to the cloud. Next is around linking value creation to investment. One of the things I loved going through the transformation was thinking well beyond just IT costs. You need to ensure you have the full picture of the value that's coming from a transformation. That's from growing revenue, you'll see mitigating losses, driving efficiencies. You really need to have a full scale picture of what's going on versus I know some of the experience in the beginning of my time in IT finance, it was very heavily focused on just IT costs, accounting treatment, and allocations. And it really wasn't providing the full benefit that you could to the organization as you went through that. The next one is around sometimes, and anybody in the finance profession knows, you'll get the jokes from other leaders around what role you play. Are you the numbers person? Do they try to box you in? And I think the experience I had was not feeling boxed in and contributing directly to the success of the transformation. The one reason I got into finance as a profession is because you can able to see the big picture. You can influence things at a macro level. And I think all of you as finance professionals are really set up for success in having great perspective and the ability to influence as you go through this transformation. The next is around thinking big. I think one of the value props that I know I provided and my team provided through the transformation was to really challenge conventional thinking and to think from a longer term strategy standpoint. What would some of this unlock and what would it be, drive capabilities for? So I would encourage all of you all to think big as you go through this transformation and encourage big ideas within your organization. And then lastly, one of the big changes for me in leading a team was around the level of talent required to drive this transformation, but also the level of excitement inside the organization around the analytics, the technical knowledge, and the ability to influence. There was an entire sea change from when I first started in IT finance to when I left. in terms of the desire and the interest in this being an area to work in within finance. And I think I would encourage all of you all to think through kind of attracting and retaining the best talent as you all go through this migration. And you will naturally see it as it happens, given the value that this work has. But it's something you can think about and use as a recruiting tool on the front end as well. I'd love to pivot real quick before we get into another poll and share a little bit of just the cloud economics and some of the specifics of things for you all to consider. So I'll quickly go through this for awareness. First is around I know for me, the first several years in running a non-public cloud infrastructure and finance team, there was you'll see the attributes of a traditional technology consumption model. There was just a lot of lead times, a lot of approvals, and a lot of process ultimately to get infrastructure, which could be compute, storage, networking gear, into the data centers that you manage or into an outsourced provider if that's what you're leveraging. The lead times were incredibly long, as well as just there's a high cost of failure. Once you procured something that cost a lot of money, it wasn't something you wanted to write down, so you had to find ways to leverage it effectively, even though technology was moving at a fast pace. If you correlate that to kind of cloud technology consumption, this element of enabling resources all throughout the company to secure these services is really empowering. It's kind of on-demand secured procurement processes, and you can turn things off and on very quickly, which is great. The other value you'll see on the bottom portion of the image is around optimization. There's a lot of empowerment that comes from not only finance teams, but the developer community and the business as well around driving efficiency and optimization and having a way to influence variable cost versus feeling like there's nothing you can do with a fixed cost once it's there. These are a couple of resources in terms of change management elements that I wanted to share with you all. One of the lessons learned is you can't take kind of your old practices and just put them into the cloud and assume those processes continue. So it really unearths a lot of opportunities and complexity and excitement for those that are involved in capacity planning and in finance specifically within this transition. And you can see some of the elements that are here. It constantly evolves. I really encourage that bottom right one. It's a constant evolution of cost management and cost governance and value creation. And it's something that you all need to keep in mind as you go through this. And then lastly, I found this really interesting. It was the International Data Corporation did a study of AWS customers and really asked them after they went through a transformation, what was the value and the benefits you got from the cloud? And you can see it kind of fits really well into the AWS Cloud Value framework. But the key takeaway is cost may be a primary driver why people come into the mix of AWS or other cloud providers. And while that's really vital and really critical, there's just so many more benefits around developer productivity, resilience, and agility that really dominate that. And you can see that from the survey results that are here, which is over 90% of the business value is outside of the cost savings element, even though those are definitively savings that you get through the process. So I know I went through a lot and we have time at the Q&A to ask any questions, but I'd love to dive in and hopefully the next poll will work. So I'll turn it back over to you for the poll. You all could take a few minutes and read the question specifically around how are you involved as a finance leader in the transformation. This really begins to talk to, and will give all of us a data point specifically around where we are in playing the role in this. So I see a lot of votes coming in, so that's great. I'll give you 10 more seconds if you could get your votes in. Like it's slowly slowing down. I don't know, Sydney, if you could show the results, or I'm happy to share the results as I see them coming in as well. Great, I'll share the results. It looks like if you looked on that scale of not very involved to heavily involved, the majority of this group actually is playing a really critical role. Basically roughly over 50% of those who responded are either a 4 or a 5, playing a heavy role in leading through this, which is really encouraging to hear and exciting, I'm sure, for many of you inside the organization. So thank you for those results. Appreciate that. And I'd love to welcome back Phil, if you don't mind coming back on camera, specifically to talk through Hey, Phil. Specifically to talk through the relationship between a CIO and a CFO. I know in the 20 years that I was in Capital One, there was a lot of CIOs and technology leaders that I engaged with, and we thought it would be helpful to talk through the keys to the relationship, because at times there could be kind of challenging and differing views. Sometimes CIOs really don't believe others inside the organization understand the complexity that comes with managing large applications and the availability that comes with that. And there's a lot of times I know in finance we talk through why things cost so much or why things take so long, and really having some empathy on that. So we thought we could just do a Q&A style back between Phil and I, and I'd start with some questions for Phil. So Phil, given your experience with finance leaders and CFOs, what are a few attributes that you value most in a CFO? I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, and Chris, I think you touched on a few of these, so you must have read my mind. You said one of the reasons you became a CFO is because it gave you a wide purview of the organization. I think there's a few roles like that. Obviously, the CEO, the CIO, and the Chief People Officer. And I think there's an interesting trifecta there. Between the finance officer, HR, and IT, you've got people, technology, and investment. So I think those three roles in particular, role modeling what it is to collaborate, what it means to break down silos and to lead beyond silos. So rather than being a functional leader, truly being a business leader and partnering with the CIO in that way. The second one you called learning and adapting. I thought that was incredibly important. I think it's really important that we as leaders don't stop learning anyway. But one of the general characteristics of leaders in agile organizations is that appetite to learn. And I think in our world, to become more versant with technology, CFOs are renowned for their attention to detail with the use of data. And one of the things CIOs appreciate is that partnership in helping elevate data literacy in organizations, but also just engaging in conversations about technology, wanting to learn more about where it can and can't be used. Because as we know, technology is magic, but it isn't the answer to every problem. It's how you combine that with changes to your organization to get the value. And then the investments in technology, the CFO seeing those as growth mechanisms, seeing that in the new world with agile working practices in the cloud, being willing to engage in new, more dynamic ways to budget and to hold people accountable for spending money wisely. And with the outcome of how do you maximize value versus minimize technology spend, and taking some of those big bets you talked about as well, but delivering them iteratively, but partnering with the CIO to really think big on behalf of the organization.
I love that. Yeah, that's encouraging to hear. And thanks, Phil, for sharing your viewpoint on that. I'd love to ask you one other question. As you played the role in the digital transformation throughout McDonald's, what role did the cloud play in enabling that for your organization, and how did cloud influence your financial management practices inside the organization?
Yeah, cloud was essential. We started to experiment with cloud in about 2010. By 2013, we'd moved our first major workload to the cloud and re-engineered it. And the reason it was so critical is a company like McDonald's is very spiky in terms of business. You don't quite know what demand's going to be based on weather and new promotions and the such like. So both in terms of being able to satisfy customers, but also keep the CFO happy by not overspending on capacity, being able to scale dynamically with the ebbs and flow of your business was incredibly important in our business. And then the ability to move fast globally. 2017 was a big year for McDonald's. They scaled e-commerce to 20,000 restaurants, delivery to 8,000 restaurants. We simply couldn't have done that if we'd gone down the traditional procurement route of buying licenses and going through the procurement conversations and finding hosting capacity. And then finally, using the cloud to really enable the use of data at scale. In terms of the financial piece of that, going back to my comment on collaboration, I think one of the early collaborations was that FinOps team you talked about, bringing finance and technology together, really to manage the use of the cloud in a fiscally responsible way together rather than across silos. And then putting some of those basic controls in place, like automation. So you weren't spending a lot of money by leaving instances up when they weren't needed. Tagging asset so you could do accurate reporting and cost allocation. And then working together between finance and IT to make the best choices in technology, which were both fiscally responsible, but also going to meet our business needs. That collaboration was critical in McDonald's, and the cloud really enabled us to start our digital transformation at scale. So back at you. So with your CFO hat on, Chris, what's your perspective on the partnership between CFOs and CIOs?
Yeah, great question. A lot of consistencies to what you mentioned in the reverse dynamic. So I know one of the elements that I really appreciated with CIO partners was the willingness to teach. That was something you called out, which is learning kind of the elements that matter, focusing on the technology to the point that proficiency and embedding yourself in the business. And CIOs who are willing to invest the time and efforts to kind of help bring along some of the technical knowledge and awareness was something I really valued. Another was just an openness to listen and hear another perspective and be influenced. I've worked with so many CIOs, some who were really strong in their points of view and sometimes maybe would not listen as much, and others who would kind of invite and listen in to other perspectives, even beyond technology. And that's something I really valued, and really the ability to have empathy and listen effectively. A third element for me was just around inclusion. One of the key elements that finance practitioners, and especially those in financial planning and analysis roles, they want to feel included. They want to feel that they can contribute in ways beyond just the numbers. And very much like you mentioned, between HR, finance, and technology, there's a really tight partnership in all the teams I've been a part of. And CIOs who kind of create and see the value of those multiple perspectives and include others into the mix of what's going on within the team and within the strategy is an attribute that I deeply value. And then lastly, you mentioned as well the accountability side of this. Obviously, in finance, it's a tough balance and it's a hard line to draw between where does a finance or a CFO's accountability stop and where does the CIO's accountabilities start. So I think finding that balance, and CIOs who do a great job of listening to their CFO, empowering their CFO to provide transparency and information to their teams, but reinforcing what matters to their organization, and really carrying the mantle on being accountable to delivering upon things or making prioritization changes or making the tough calls. CIOs that do that and do that well, those are the partners that you love to support from a CFO standpoint as well.
And Chris, you talked about the migration to the cloud at Capital One. How did that change your role within the organization?
Yeah, it was a really interesting pivot through time. When I joined, most of the reason I joined IT, I was interested in technology, but I was really interested in building out my business partner relationship skills because that was a key element within the organization. But from a work standpoint in the beginning, it was very heavy accounting focused. There was just a lot of capitalization, amortization, depreciation. There was just a lot of complexity that came with the accounting elements of it. And one of the words that people either love or hate when you get into IT finance is around allocations, as you mentioned on the tagging side. So we spent a lot of time on allocations and fostering kind of buyer-seller conversations inside the organization. But that was a pretty slow pivot through time, and it really was advanced as we matured to being highly analytical, forward-looking, and really answering the question of the business value that you talked through, which is how do we communicate effectively, not only inside the organization to the vertical business leaders and the presidents of the organization, but also to our external shareholders around the value we're getting for our transformation and how that's benefiting, in this case, as a public institution, shareholders, but that also could be, depending on whoever owns the organization, the owners of the organization. So it grew a lot through time in terms of the changes. It was a highly desired area, and that forced me as a leader to ensure I was creating an environment where people could thrive. It was a place in which they could take their career and develop great skills, but also develop skills that are valuable inside and outside the organization. So there was plenty of people who came to the team and shifted to roles into technology, into the business, but also into roles outside of the organization, leveraging the great skills they had.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point you raised, Chris, and you talked about talent. It's that opportunity not only to break down silos and collaborate and communicate, but also giving people new skills as a consequence, and getting people comfortable with different ways. Each of our functions talks different language, and making people comfortable with that. So yeah, I appreciate those insights. We did have, we'll open this up for questions for a few minutes. So if you've got questions, certainly encourage you to post those. We had one question, probably more in your domain, Chris. What would a good benchmark ratio for infrastructure to sales revenue be? This was specific for a fintech software company. That's probably a little bit too specific, but when you looked at Capital One, did you look at, how did you look at benchmarking costs?
Yeah, great question. There was always a balance for us in Capital One of looking at internal benchmarks and trends and run rates and how things were evolving, but also looking externally. I think business makeup and business mix is a key element and a key consideration as you think about benchmarking externally. I know Capital One's business mix was a little bit more heavily weighted to the credit card lending side versus an investment banking or commercial banking side. So one, there's great partners that you can partner with to do some of that benchmarking, but also internally, we did a lot of our own benchmarking ourselves as we went through the transformation of not only having great data on the front end of what our infrastructure costs, and specifically looking at different workloads, but trying to make that comparable as we went through and managed the business case of our cloud transformation. Because one of the observations we saw as we went through this is we drove a lot of unit cost savings as we went to the cloud, but in the beginning, we saw a lot more volume consumption of compute, as an example, as well, because engineers had kind of open access to that. So I think on the benchmarking side, at least from my experience at Capital One, we focus pretty heavily on our internal comparables and our trends and such. We did look at the macro elements, but we always had some challenges with benchmarks around having the right business mix to ensure it was comparable. But I think keeping an eye internal and external are both good best practices. I don't have specific numbers to share because of and it's probably unique to the industry that's there. But I think looking at some key KPIs of big services that are consumed, storage, compute, elements of networking cost, obviously the developer cost. And then for us, we spent a lot of time on efficiency ratio, which was how much are we investing in technology and how much relative to how much revenue we're driving as a company. Efficiency ratio and technology efficiency ratio was a key KPI that we leveraged as well.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, Chris. There's been a bunch of research around that showing those companies that are truly agile and recognize they're getting value from technology actually spend more on technology as a consequence rather than treat it as a cost to be controlled. I'm going to keep you on the hot seat. There was a couple of questions around, I guess, managing the change. Firstly, in your team, in your finance team, how did you bring people along on this journey that finance was going to be managed differently in the cloud world?
Yeah, I think it's pretty hard to do until you start experiencing it, because it's really hard to think about what may be different. I know not only just our cloud transformation, but our agile transformation really changed a lot of the ways in which we do actuals analysis, forecasting, all the elements that come with finance practitioners. And some of this opened up new capabilities, but in the beginning, I think it created some confusion because people were going through the change curve that were there. So in terms of how do we navigate it, I think one, kind of giving people the space and the capacity to learn new things was really, really important as we went through that. Recognizing that there's going to be some change that comes with that. So having reasonable expectations as you go through that change, but also incentivizing and recognizing those who are really accelerating through that change was a big element of focus that we did. So really rewarding and elevating people who were really taking advantage of this, driving new modeling, driving new insights, really diving deep, because it opens up a whole new world when you get into the cloud around optionality and options that exist that developers have and driving efficiencies and workload. And that element that you mentioned, and I know I mentioned as well, of that tight partnership with finance and the business and the development teams, it kind of really empowers those in finance to drive direct value versus feeling like you're just pushing peas around the plate at times and you're not delivering any change or any value to the organization. So I think it was giving them space, but also kind of rewarding and recognizing those who were really leaning into the opportunity.
The other thing I've seen, Chris, is a few organizations, we do the cloud practitioner certification, which is gives you the basic lingo of cloud. Putting folks who aren't technologists through that is really, this idea of sharing a common language is extremely powerful as you go through a change, making people feel comfortable with that as well. Pick up on the poll you just ran. So there's a few answers which indicated people weren't that involved or not involved at all in the transformation, on the business-wide transformation. If you're not involved at the moment, where would you start? What would you say would be a good starting point to start either the transformation or to become part of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one, kind of being curious and asking questions and understanding what the business strategy is and how technology is enabling that strategy is a good first step. So I think asking questions and understanding where you and your team and the collective organization is going on the strategy side is a good first step, because once you have a sense of what that strategy is, and then you can understand how you can help enable that. If your organization potentially has not outlined a business strategy that's aligned to the desired outcomes, I think beginning to think through what that may look like and begin to foster conversations around what your point of view is. I think one of the things that I valued in the experience is not just being a bystander, but being a contributor as a part of this. So feeling empowered to begin formulating your thoughts, getting those on paper, and beginning to socialize and share some of those thoughts to get like-minded people together is a great first step. I think another one specifically is engaging your CIO, back to the relationships between a CIO and CFO. If I've seen, in the short time I've been here, I've seen some different relationships between CFOs and CIOs. Some instances where they rarely talk. They may just have a month-end conversation around where things go, and there's limited engagement beyond that. I think if you find yourself in that circumstance, you've got to be playing a more active and influencing role with your CIO, looking where you can add value to the conversation, but also help enable them accomplish the transformation that they're looking to go. So I think it's just like most things in business, where can you add unique value and perspective and begin to add that and encourage that? And then the last thing I would share, Phil, is, and some of that is modeling for your team, because I think it's encouraging their teams as well, because I know in managing a large team at Capital One, there are people embedded in all different levels of the organization. It doesn't have to be just the most senior levels. There could be multiple levels down below the CIO that's really driving and delivering on the technology strategy. And if your team is embedded there, really take advantage of their embeddedness to help agitate and drive some of that change from the middle up and the bottom up versus just from the top down in all cases. So those would be some of my thoughts. I don't know, Phil, if you have some thoughts on that same question.
No, I think you touched on one, which is someone came up with a quote the other day about at the C-suite level, are you a team of leaders or a leadership team? And I think it's moving away from those transactional relationships. And as you know, one thing we're passionate about is, how do we educate? So there was one question about transformations. How do you get everyone else on board outside of the CFO and CIO? I think it starts with education. What is digital transformation in business terms? Where does technology support that? Why cloud? How do you become more data literate? So I think just some of those basic block and tackling. Sometimes we assume knowledge where it doesn't exist, and that's one of the areas I think we enjoy a lot, is having those conversations at C-suite level to help folks understand how all this comes together for their organization. Well, we're coming up close to time. Chris, thank you so much for doing Q&A and for taking us through the Capital One journey. For everyone who attended, thank you for being here. Hopefully this content has sparked some interest and inspired you to seek a little bit more information about how you can help drive transformation in your organization. It's such a critical topic. Through the report I referenced earlier, we see there's 90% of business leaders are worried about keeping up with demand from their customers and even understanding what their customers want. So we're passionate about this and how we, from our past experience and using the cloud, can really help accelerate the relevancy of your organization. So once again, thank you very much for spending time with us, and please take a minute or so to complete the survey. Thanks for your time.